Thank you for joining us this afternoon at the Heritage Foundation and in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions and remind them that questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We will post the program on our website following the program for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our discussion today is Derek Scissors, Research Fellow for Asia Economic Policy in our Asian Studies Center. He focuses on the economies of China and India, as well as broader economic trends in Asia. He also serves as an adjunct professor at George Washington University. Before joining us here, he was a China economist at Intelligence Research, where he wrote and edited its China Weekly Bulletin, China Watch, and China Quarterly Forecast. Please join me in welcoming Derek Scissors. Derek?
Thanks, John. I'll just step at the podium for a second. We're going to have a conversation. Obviously, there are not a lot of people here. I will pitch why you all are brilliant to be here and at the foresight of change that will overwhelm the world in the next 35 years, and you'll be able to say you were here not when it started, but when it came to Washington. All I'm going to do is stand up and say that Barun Mitra, my co-discussant here, is director of the Liberty Institute in India. He has many hats, but the Liberty Institute in particular stands for many of the principles, maybe most, of the same principles as the Heritage Foundation in terms of individual freedom and bringing democracy and freedom to India. Liberty has a big edge over Heritage in that they get credit for working in a tough environment, and you're going to see how tough that is and how many things we take for granted in Barun's discussion. So I'm going to go back and sit down, give you a little overview of why I think this topic is absolutely vital and really could change the world in the next 35 years. And then Barun's going to talk about the front lines where things will actually happen. Thanks. So I'm going to do the macro intro. Yeah. So there aren't very many people here. It's a tough topic. It's raining. We had a big event upstairs. If we had had this event in May 1978 about China, no one would have come. Right? There was a Heritage Foundation, but no one would have come. No one would have cared. China's backwater. It's incredibly poor. The change in property rights regime in China, which was actually in some ways very minor, was letting people rent their land plots and keep the excess production and sell it themselves. Change in property rights regime in China is what triggered the rise of China. Everything comes from that. Everything came from that. You had greater agricultural productivity because people had greater property rights, which is what we're talking about today. When you had greater agricultural productivity, people didn't need to work on the farm, so they moved to the cities, so they could manufacture things, so they could sell them overseas. The whole Chinese story starts with property rights and then is ratified by Deng Xiaoping. We can go back farther than that. The British story, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, starts with property rights. All development starts with secure property rights to land. It all starts from that. It starts from agricultural productivity. It starts with migration to the cities. It starts with the creation of urban manufacturing centers, right? It all comes back from, if you own your land, you're more productive. You can sell to productive people. You can be a productive farmer, and all development comes from that. And that's an abstract introduction. The concrete introduction is, why is China supposedly heading towards being the second global economic superpower? It's because in 1977 and 1978 they granted sharper property rights to land. So that's what we're talking about for India, and as we know, the size of the Indian population, the importance of the Indian economy means the same thing can happen in India. But in the Chinese case, it was a grassroots movement, and then Deng Xiaoping said, I bless this, and it was so. That isn't going to happen in India. It's a tougher thing to try to accomplish. There needs to be grassroots work that wins people over, district by district, state by state. The various parties, India is a multi-party system. So the scope is there for property rights in India to change the world as much as the rise of China has in the last 35 years. It's absolutely there. I can see it in front of me. Barun can. Hopefully at the end of this you will be able to. But it's going to be a really tough haul because there isn't somebody in charge to say, I have decided this is the right thing. The big advantages to that, you don't have an oppressive communist party. Disadvantages, it's a slow slog through the Indian political system. So what I'd like Barun to do, and I'll interrupt and pepper him with questions, and we will, please ask questions from the audience, because it's a small group, we can do that, is talk about his work on the ground, and then after he brings us up to date on that, we'll talk about what are the prospects for India being able to nationalize these property rights to land for individuals, make it a national change the whole Indian economy, and change the world economy. So, Barun, if you could start with talking about your work on the ground, what you're trying to do, get into details, and then we'll bring it back and link it up to the global change.
Thanks, Derek. Let me give it a shot. Actually, it was at Heritage in 2000 that I had met Hernando de Soto, one of the proponents of property rights as a building block, as a foundation for economic development. And this issue had interested me for a long time, but there was also the question that, that we can have all the history and the theory with us, yet fail to put it on the ground. And so we were thinking of how actually we could go about doing something that can actually make a difference. And we chose, for various reasons which I'll explain, some of the poorest villages and areas in India, which are very remote in the forest areas, pretty difficult to connect in terms of the market access and roads and electricity. And we chose those areas because those are some of the areas where about 75 to 80 million Indians live, primarily indigenous tribes of various kinds. And those are the areas which, since the British rule in India, had been taken on as public land, that is forest and things. And these people may have lived there for generations, but had no title to land. They were looked upon as encroachers, or they were at best tolerated since the state didn't have the wherewithal to throw out 50, 60 million people from such areas. Yeah, that's one of the blessings of being a democracy in India than somewhere else. So there was a campaign from 2003 onwards, 2003 to 6 in India, where a lot of people, including some from the extreme left, joined hands to demand that this is an historic injustice that needs to be corrected. That campaign resulted, in one of those rare instances, in a new law, which came up in 2006. It's kind of popularly known as the Forest Rights Act. That law, for the first time, recognizes not just the historic injustice done to the largely indigenous tribe, but forest dwellers as such, and also recognizes their right to claim agricultural land, which they had been using traditionally for their families, their housing land where they had built their homes, and the village commons, which can be identified as the common property of the village. This happened in 2006. They said that the law will recognize up to a maximum of 4 hectares. 4 hectares by American standard is not too much of a land. By Indian standards, it's pretty large. And very few people with family and animal power to use on agricultural fields can actually plow 4 hectares on their own. Because these are, like I said, remote areas without access to the tractors and the equipments that are necessary to be able to plow 4 hectares. So that's how, so we chose those areas because the law came up after a sustained campaign, and therefore the people were sensitive to the issue. The interesting thing about this evolution of this law was that while the campaign was very significantly led by some of the leading left-wing leaders and extreme left extremists in the campaign, but they had a problem. The problem was, ideologically, they didn't believe in private property. They believed land should be, particularly in these areas, should be communally owned, like the whole village own it as a total community. But when the parliamentary committee, which was hearing this bill, went to some of the villages, almost 95% of the people said they would all prefer private titles. And so the lawmakers went back and they drafted the bill saying that the title would be granted to up to a maximum of 4 hectares to every adult couple. That is, the land would be jointly titled in the name of the husband and wife as a basic unit of the family. And they could till the land, keep the house, and the community can assert and claim the rights over the common land which is necessary for grazing or for firewood and for other such usage. Then came another part of the challenge. So it's kind of clear that it became clear to us that it's not sufficient that you win a law. You got to put it in practice. You got to implement the law. And here we ran into, of course, the maze of Indian bureaucracy. No department of the government wants to surrender what they have. So the land was seen as kind of their empire, their domain, and they wouldn't like to give it up so easily. It is here that, that things that made it possible was possible because there were advances in technology which made us accessible, made the whole process, accessible. 10, 15 years ago, what we are trying today would not have been possible. 15 years ago, there was no Google with its maps. And there were no GPS which common man could use. So what we did was, the law said that there's a cutoff year of December 2005. That if you can demonstrate with certain parameters of evidences that you were really using that piece of land as of December 2005, then you can claim it. And you will be recognized, your title will be recognized. So we went about acquiring a few GPS devices. We searched around Google Maps to see what kind of maps are available for these areas. Then we went to the villages and showed them that you can see your village on a computer network and you can identify your land. We trained, in every village, we trained about a few people who learned how to use the GPS. And this was very important for us, firstly, because we are not a funding organization, so we cannot fund a project like this. Secondly, even more importantly, we wanted the community, the people, the local residents of those areas to claim ownership of the process. It's very important to have any change which is claimed and owned by the people themselves. The prospect of sustaining such change is that much greater. So we trained, in every village we trained at least 2-3 people who could use the GPS. We were helped because, if any of you have seen a kind of a handheld GPS, it's very similar to a mobile device, a cell phone. And therefore, since quite a few villages had used cell phones, so they were used to the screen and the keyboard, and therefore they could pick up GPS, learn how to use the GPS to plot the boundaries. But what convinced me of this whole exercise, that was in 2010 when I went to some of these villages with my friends, was that, that these people had never seen a satellite image, because the satellite image is from the top, it's a topographical picture. These people have hardly ever, in fact, none had flown. They had no idea what it looks from the top. But given that they knew their own areas like the back of their hands, completely. Therefore, within half an hour, they could look at the image, get it oriented, and identify the key landmarks. Once that was done, it was just a matter of hours before each plot on the map could be identified. So I didn't really expect that this could happen in that kind of a remote area to people who had hardly ever seen or used a computer or a satellite image, but this was possible. That kind of convinced us that, that we can do it. And the reason we wanted to do it also is because a lot of the people who were in the initial campaign, once the law was passed, they left it to the government, to the state agencies, to actually do it. But of course, the state agencies would have their own limitations apart from the inertia and the opposition that the departments may have, the forest department in particular. So we wanted to see that if we, that we demonstrate that this is our law and we need to claim the territory. The people need to take the initiative to claim their land. It's not something that comes from the top, it's something that grows from the bottom. And that's where I think we succeeded in the last 2 years. We've covered more than 100 villages. That's about 20,000 plots. This year, we hope to cover another 100 plus villages, which would be another 20,000 plots. And recently, there are 2 landmark judgments that have come, which I think has greatly boosted our kind of a morale, and also the realistic prospect of kind of it really, if you can take it to the tipping point, it can be a wildfire. Last week, there was late last month, there was a judgment from the Supreme Court of India on a mining issue. We have a lot of projects which are stuck because of land, mining being one such. The Supreme Court ruled that because of this Forest Right Act that had been passed in 2006, mining projects or any such projects happening in their lands, in these lands, need to have the consent of the village assembly. To us, that was a huge step. Instead of a decision being taken in the national capital or at the state capital, decision-making comes down to the bottom. That's enormously empowering for the reason that it will reduce the prospect of favoritism and corruption that is inevitable in such major projects. Secondly, there was another judgment by the High Court of the state of Gujarat, where we are primarily working, which ruled just on last Friday that the government of that province must review all the claims that they have rejected in the last 2 years. Because the evidence that we are providing are legitimate and seems plausible, and therefore the government has the agency looking after reviewing this process must consider the evidences that we are providing. So these 2 things kind of gave us great hope that this can really spread. And it can spread, like I'm saying, it probably will cover 80 to 90 million Indians in 75 districts across the country. And it can be a fire. It can be a fire.
Let me kind of put this out for people, especially people who will be watching now or later. India, there was basically no private ownership of land, right? There were people who were rich and felt politically secure in the land that they were occupying, but the state owns the resources, including the water. Imagine what it's like to try to be a farmer where the state owns the water. And there's in the American term, there's a kind of permanent sense of eminent domain. We want to run a project here. So the land belongs to the state. You're just going to have to figure out something. See you. And this is antithetical to what will actually ground economic development. So the situation is awful. It's awful. I mean, India is stuck with a property rights to land system that ensures backwardness. It ensures low agricultural productivity. I mean, it means that only part of India can develop, the part that's integrated with the world economy, and it leaves out the vast bulk of the population, the 600, 700 million people. Now, what Barun has just laid out is there have been a series of successes, which are stunning, marvelous successes, where for political reasons that don't really have to do with we want better property rights, but just historical injustice, as he said, one group, 1/10 of the people affected, get some improvement to land rights. Technology comes along and allows a group like Barun's to go in and help these people, and so that it's not just a law, it actually applies. And now you're getting court reaction. We're saying, well, it seems to apply over here. Why wouldn't it apply over here? That's the way it's going to work in a democracy. It's not going to be, we have ordered that everyone now has more property rights to their land. It's going to be a little step by step by step. There has to be groups on the front line like Barun's, and hopefully he'll tell you how to follow up if you're interested. But there's a long way to go. This is one group. It's still the case in the mining case. You have to deal with the village, but it's assumed that the resources belong to the government. No one can own those resources except the government. It's not like a company is coming in and saying, hey, you own the land that has this mine. We've discovered valuable things here. We want to buy it from you. No, the government owns it, and now we have to negotiate with these people instead of just taking it from them. So we have a huge, long way to go still, because we started from a situation where there are no rights, which is bothers people at Heritage. Both the economics of it is terrible, and the politics of it is terrible. We've seen this very recent. It's only recently that this is possible. I did a trip with someone who's in the audience, Nick Zahn, to India in 2009, talking about property rights to land, and most of the people in the audience didn't know what I was talking about. Well, what do you mean? I said, well, why don't you own all the things on your land? If there's oil on your land, why don't you own it? Well, we can't own oil. It belongs to the state. The mindset isn't even there to understand property rights to land, and yet because of historical injustice, because of technology, because of frontline groups, you're starting to see the spread. We haven't seen the transformation of the Indian economy. So I want to ask Barun a question, and then after that, anyone can interrupt at any time. You're doing this frontline work in this one area, and you've talked about how mining should apply to forests. The mining rules should apply, the forest rules should apply to mining, and you guys have come up with evidence that Gujarat needs to consider. Talk about the state of the situation nationally in light of you guys have started the process. But on the other hand, as you know very well, better than I, you're starting from a situation where property rights to land are almost this alien concept, where you can't own the resources, and the state doesn't want to give up any of its prerogatives. Can you talk about how you think this wildfire could spread? How can we get India to where property rights for land are taken for granted? Of course it's my land, and if you want to buy it, we can conduct a deal the way we would do in the United States without a second thought, which it does not occur in India. There's no land market. How can we get that wildfire to spread? What comes in? I know you're on the front line, so I'm asking you to go up to the Google Maps level and look at how you could extend the fire.
There's one thing I can actually share. In the Indian Constitution written in 1950, it came into force in 1950, 26 January, we were one of the few countries in the world which had among its fundamental rights, like your Bill of Rights, the right to property. The United States didn't have the right to property. It had life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in its declaration. But right to property, and it had intellectual property as one, but right to property was assumed as so ingrained that it didn't really have a separate mention. Whereas the Indian fundamental rights, which is kind of parallel to your Bill of Rights, which has the freedom of expression and the rest, right to property was the last of the fundamental rights. We had 8 of them and 19(1)(f). That was in 1950. But the very first amendment to the Constitution in 1951 was an attempt to dilute that right. And since then, no matter which party has governed India, or which was the political orientation of the government, this particular right had been singularly diluted to the extent that it got deleted from the Indian Constitution in 1978, with just one vote against it.
I just want to say how amazing that is. India went backward. It started with a good attitude towards the right to property, and instead of development and progress, which we imagine all countries go through, the United States certainly has developed, they went backward in history. 28 years later, they were going backward 300 years. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and to understand this, to me, what really makes this interesting is not just what happened, but the political dynamics that made it happen. The whole world in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was leaning towards more state-driven socialist economies, and therefore the intellectual climate was of that leaning, that right, property is something that only the rich require, and after all, we don't need the rich, so right to property is not such a useful tool. But to me, what is critical to understand this process is this is precisely when in 1978, the first opposition government formed in Delhi at the national level deleted this right with just one vote against it in parliament. Within 2 to 3 years, there was perhaps the largest protest against invocation of eminent domain on a dam that was coming up in the same province of Gujarat where we are currently working. That the people may accept or may be by law, force of law, be made to accept, that eminent domain is to be accepted and the state has the right to invoke it when it feels necessary. But equally, in an open society, the people would have the right to come out and protest. So it was in 1980s, and that's when I became aware of the significance of the change that is taking place. In 1980-81, within 3 years of this constitutional amendment, that the popular protest started, till it, in a way, it culminated in 2006 with this law. This is the first time in the last 60 years that a law was enacted to reinforce property. All this while there had been attempt to dilute it, to eliminate it, and to keep it out. And to me, what is interesting is, and to go back to one macro or a big picture that kind of motivated many of us in this, property is necessary not just for economic development. Ownership of property is the foundation of citizenship to your stake in your community. For a free political society, right to property is as critically important as it is for laying the foundations for economic development. And it is that India seems to be very unique in this world, and correct me if I'm wrong, that throughout history, Derek went back a few centuries. You can go back to ancient Greece. Citizenship was defined by property. United States in 1776, citizenship was defined by property ownership. India had a constitution that recognized right to property but kept diluting it, but we remained a political democracy. And today what we are witnessing throughout the 1980s and today is that political aspiration getting hold. That people are no longer willing to accept law just because it's in the books.
David.
David Kreutzer with the Heritage Foundation. I have a couple of questions, which I hope isn't a violation of the rules. The first is, are there other organizations or people trying to do what you're doing, or maybe even making a profit at it? It seems like there's not a huge capital cost.
You've got a possible competitor over there.
And second, what rights come with this? Can you sell the property? Do you get mineral rights and so on?
And can I interrupt
Yes,
to make
please.
an extension? I'm thinking about, I see this very easily when it's a rural, agricultural, very land-based, but how is this going to play out for those urban versus rural, for this concept if it is so foreign to?
It's a lot of ground to cover. Good luck. I'll be over here.
Help me out. Now, to take David's second question first, this would, as the law stands, minings and things, it's like a kind of a British tradition that they belong to the crown or to the state. But what we believe, particularly from the Supreme Court judgment last month, that you can't access those things unless you can access the land. And if the land is now, as per the court's decision, is to be decided by the community locally and not by the state agencies at the top, I think the seeds of property are being laid. It will not lead to immediate royalty on minerals or oil or whatever, but I think if the people can claim the right to the land on top, I think they have a reasonable chance of taking it forward. And the reason they have a reasonable chance is because, many of you may not know or may not believe, that India is a poor country. It tries to attract a lot of investment from across the world. Yet, $100 billion worth of investment have been stuck in the last 5-7 years because of the problem associated with land. So industry groups and investors are all looking for ways to figure out how to crack this nut.
Essentially, there is no land market. So if you need to buy land from something, it's a political decision. The state gets involved and there's a negotiation, mediation. There's no transaction. You can't go to someone and say, I'd like to buy your land because I have this project. And they say, well, I want more money, and you negotiate. That doesn't exist. The negotiation is purely political. And it's been held up in time after time after time after time.
But in Gujarat, where you've established these rights, do they have, can these farmers, after maybe farming it for a while, sell the land to the next farmer who maybe wants to get the tractor?
Yeah, I knew this would come. This was your first question. I kind of look at it, and I try to convince many of my friends in India too about this, that we need to be able to clearly distinguish between an ideal and a principle which we all cherish, and the political and social context in which it can be actually put in place. We cannot create an ideal utopian world anytime, and surely we cannot make that jump overnight. The very limited thing, come to think of it, from the fact that we had right to property to its deletion, we are making the first step from the bottom to recognize that right. So the right comes with a lot of restrictions. One of them being you cannot sell beyond your communities, which would mean that the prices will get depressed because the communities are anyway poor. But it would also mean that some people in the community may be able to consolidate. And our belief is that if this process is sustained, which we believe it would be sustained given the last 30 years of history, these restrictions will be, people will be chipping at these restrictions over the next 10, 20 years. And it will happen because of the thing that I said, just a little while ago. It will happen because ownership of property is empowering people as citizens. That their vote counts. They can bring down a government if it really pushes hard on any of these issues. So to me, it is what makes India really interesting and unique in the intellectual or the historical sense is we are perhaps the only democracy who are not only poor, but who did not rely on property to build its democracy. But property is coming back as people are claiming it because they are part of democracy. So this kind of, it's kind of a role.
Right. I mean, your question, Dave, is obviously crucial. If you can transfer ownership of land, you get more efficient farmers, which frees up the people, which is all the development things I talked about. That's part of the reason why I said this is going to be a long slog. I mean, as Barun just outlined, India went backwards. It went down to the bottom. It wasn't at the bottom. It had property rights, and it went back, took them away. So there's a long way to climb, and in a democracy, it takes a long time to do it. The way I would think about it for people who are thinking about India, on the Hill, whenever they think about India, if you want to know, which is once every 6 months. If you want to know whether India is going to be this force in the world, if you want to know whether the Indian economy is going to transform the world economy, if you want to know whether India is going to become a global power, this is the process. The process is slow, but at least it's going in the right direction, and at least you have the logic of once you give people limited property rights who can vote, they say, well, I don't understand. Why do I get to do this and not this? Why can't I sell to someone in the next village over? This is ridiculous. And they vote you out of office when you say no. So it is going to be a long way to go. I don't want to depress Barun here because we need everybody on the front lines. There's a long way to go, but this is the process that determines whether India becomes this world colossus economically, politically, and otherwise. So this is what to watch. Do you get the court decisions Barun has cited, they're geostrategic in implication, even though no one thinks of them that way. But if you get an additional right to your land, okay, you can bequest it to people outside your immediate family. If you get this step-by-step process, that's what's going to determine India's role in the world. And that's a big jump because we're looking at really micro things, but that's what determined Britain's role in the world. That's where the Industrial Revolution came from. So my answer to you is no, they can't. They've got a long way to go to do the things that we want associated with property rights, but we're moving in the right direction now, and this is world-shaking. This is a giant kind of slowly waking up, and it's going to take a while. You got to poke and poke and poke and poke and poke, but that's the scale involved.
Also, I'm not sure whether it'll really take that long, because social processes
Glad you're
can
more
be
optimistic
leveraged.
than me.
Yeah, I'm much more optimistic. I'm much more optimistic because I couldn't believe that we could cover 100 villages, 20,000 plots, village by village, without any resource from anybody. It's happening because people are coming to us. Once the word, it spreads that we can do this, that they can do it. So they're not looking to us that we will fund them and they'll do it. They believe that it's a demand that they have, and we are only providing a methodology and a platform where they can make it happen. To come to John's question on the urban thing, the reason we avoided like disorder, he focused on urban land. Particularly slum lands, unrecognized land in urban areas. The reason we chose this remote areas is because we wanted to avoid a frontal conflict that we would face if we go to an urban area in Mumbai or Delhi, where not only is there a slum established there for 20, 30 years, but there's a whole group of political, business, builders. All these lobbies are eyeing to get a part of that slice because these are now prime property. So to get into that field, we could have faced, physical elimination because these are. That's the reason why when my friends and I, we were debating this, we really deliberately decided that we need to be able to figure out a practical way, to take De Soto's idea much beyond where he had taken. Urban land would invariably attract these interest groups and therefore conflict.
Right.
And we chose this, and if we succeed in this, we might be able to use it as a springboard because there would be one big change. If we have to do something similar in urban India or anywhere in urban areas, we would need a much higher degree of accuracy rather than these handheld GPS. In a rural setting in India, particularly where the rights are not even there, 10 feet, 20 feet on this side or that side don't make too much of a difference. In fact, what we found is that villages where they had no legal rights yet, people were willing to settle their boundary differences in the belief that if they don't put their dispute on paper today, they might get a clean title tomorrow. So instead of going through the court cases and all the rest, they kind of have an interest in trying to settle down precisely because these are kind of virgin lands.
Right, and
these have never been
he just said the magic word in India, court. In urban areas, you'd end up in court, which means you're going nowhere, right? And the decision would just be a nightmare to read and so on. So there's just the marginal value of starting in rural areas is a lot higher. Obviously, you could argue the economic return in urban areas is higher, but you got, as Barun said, there are a lot of sharks in that water.
So another question on the urban rights. Obviously, there's been a lot of growth, economic growth in urban India. How are the industries that are investing and are putting capital investment on the ground, how are they sort of operating the system to make sure that nobody expropriates their factory or their office building?
Corruption.
Yeah, we did an estimation just a couple of years ago, my friend and I, that...
I was just clearing my throat. Sorry.
That, the extent of corruption, we have had last couple of years huge protests in India on public corruption. But hardly anyone has mentioned or noted that 1 to 2% of India's GDP is being generated each year due to corruption related to real estate and property. And in cities like Delhi and Mumbai, the two major cities, it could be as high as 20 to 25% of the local GDP or the city GDP. It's enormous. And therefore, there are increasing realization among investors and businesses too, that for all these years they thought if you had good friends in power, in position of influence, you could get away with it. You can't get away with it anymore. Democracy has deepened. People are beginning to believe they are citizens and they cannot be thrown out. Which is why, for instance, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, when property rights was deleted from the Constitution, it was quite common to see the city government sending in the bulldozers to clean the slums. Today, it's unthinkable. You do that, the next election, you'll be whitewashed. And I think this is a very big power.
So, I mean, that was obviously a little bit cutesy remark on my part, but just think about when property rights are contested and you have something valuable. You protect it in any way you can. You pay people off. You pay court officials off if you can pay them off if it's going to go to the court. You pay government officials. You pay potential competitors off. Here, don't contest my property. You pay individuals off because you don't have any choice. You don't have strong legal right to your land. You may have the best legal right to your land, but you don't have a strong legal right to your land, which means you have to say, all right, I have a 1 in 3 chance of winning a contest, but if I just keep these people at bay, then I can continue to use my land. Corruption is a perfectly natural response to weak property rights. And, when India is obsessed with the battle over corruption, if you assign property rights, you reduce corruption greatly. So it's another obvious thing, and we're fighting. It's just funny. The political side of this is funny. Barun mentioned earlier that the left was originally heavily involved in helping these forest dwellers. A lot of the there's this, when I talk about property rights, and Barun's much more immersed into it. I'm this foreigner coming to talk about property rights in India. Everyone assume I'm like this pro huge business taking land away from people. Right? That's what they mean by rights. I'm like, no. I want people to own the land so they have the choice to sell or not.
Correct.
And say, you're not giving me enough money. It's my land. In addition to all the economic things that come out of ownership of land and specialization, I want to assign the rights to land to ordinary people and make the big companies bid for it. Whereas the behavior of the Indian state is often how do we shove people off the land? Don't fix the property rights problem. Just let us have the property rights we need to run these projects. And that's where the corruption comes in.
Correct.
Because if you can, now, I mean, I don't mean to be negative here, but if you devolve rights down to the village, then you pay off the head of the village. If you get rights down to the people, then paying off all the people is the same thing as buying their land. So you got to get it down to the individual level. Otherwise, the space for corruption is huge, and I don't blame businesses when you can't protect your legal right to something for paying people off. I mean, we'd all do the same thing. What if your house was probably your house? You got kids in your house, and it's probably your house. And you could raise the odds that it's your house by handing out a little money in the neighborhood. You'd do it in a second. I would. I don't like my neighbors, though. Other questions? I mean, I think, Barun, could you talk about how people can get more information about what's going on the ground and what you're doing? Just a little bit.
And Derek, part of that plays into mine.
Okay.
You've done this with, quote, no resources.
No resources.
Are there any resources that we could get or that you could get, or how could resources be directed to it?
Great. Thank you. So let me do the advertising. You could visit our website.
1888 Mitra.
You could visit our website for this particular initiative. It's called www.righttoproperty.org. I like that domain. And this website didn't come because we wanted to build a website. It evolved because as the number of villages were increasing from 5 to 10 to 25 to 30, the amount of data that my friend in Gujarat had to handle was rising. And therefore, we needed a platform where the data could be processed automatically through the programming. And we needed a process whereby these different villages in different places can access the data without coming to my friend in Gujarat. Because we didn't want a centralized system where everything happens through one friend who knows how to do it. So the website actually is a functioning website. That is, it is aimed at helping the village councils generate their reports for submission to the government agency. So it's a functioning website. So it doesn't have any fancy stuff on it, but it does have, if you really want to see that, it has a tab called View Plot, and if you go there and select a village, you would be able to see the 50, 100, 200 plots in the villages that have been mapped up by the villages. So this is, I feel proud that we could do such a thing in a way which has not been done even by companies like Google. In fact, I spoke to some friends in Google, they said, this is their last mile problem. Whereas we said that we are beginning at the last mile. So we'll build it from there, mile by mile. But on John's question, actually, we were doing a estimation. So far, the cost has been squeezed in by Liberty Institute and us at one end, and our friends in Gujarat at another. That is the logistics, the equipment, the web, and the development of that. Whereas the people are actually paying about, you could say, 50 cents to get the documentation right. Because they have to take the printouts, they have to do all that, so we don't pay anything. They do that, and they go around each plot to collect the data. So that's their contribution. So it's kind of a partnership. What we are looking for and what we believe is possible is, all of you would have heard of the $1 a day poverty line. The World Bank, I think it's 1.2 now, or whatever. It's kind of a rule of thumb, $1 a day poverty line across the world. And probably 1 to 1.5 billion people in the world are below that $1 a day. What we estimate is that to do this mapping process properly with all the features that we would like to improve the quality of the evidence, we probably are looking at $1 per plot, which would help these people, communities, come out of poverty, of abject poverty, and you could see some of the pictures on our website, that these are some of the remotest, poorest areas that India has. That at $1 a plot,
not every day.
Not every day, just $1 a plot, once.
Yes.
We can resolve this issue completely outside of the World Bank, of funding agencies, of anything of that kind by people themselves. And I should frankly admit that I have never seen or come across an initiative of this kind where we really believe that if we can scale it up to 1,000 villages, which would be about 200,000 plots, we can make this process financially, self-sustaining.
Right.
And we have in India, the estimate is we need to plot about 50 to 75 million just for these forest dwellers.
Right.
And we have in total 900 million plots.
Right.
That is agriculture and urban and all the things put together.
So I want to say, I've talked about how important this is and how important it is. Barun thinks it's going to happen tomorrow. I think it's going to happen in 100 years. This is the process for India. But philosophically, we're here at Heritage. This is it. Right? Giving private property rights to individuals, this is the foundation of everything that we, politically, economically, we both touched on this. I've talked on the economic. Barun's talked on the political. This is like bringing, everything that we believe in at Heritage to 750 million people. And it doesn't require $100 billion. It just requires technology and attitude and work by the locals mostly, work by people like Barun coming in from outside. So, one of the reasons I hope this video shows up well and is seen by a lot of people is this is important geopolitically, it's important for individual rights, but it's also, this is Heritage principles in action on a scale that cannot be matched anywhere else in the world. Right, so if you believe in Heritage principles, this is the place to be. I just think this is a tremendous combination of, you can actually see progress from the depths of the nadir in 1978. You see progress. It's going to change India and change the world, however fast it does, and it's exactly what we as Heritage conservatives, would hope to see in the world. I'll give Barun the last word and any other questions.
Yeah, I've been I know Heritage Foundation for more than 2 decades now, and we have been advocating policy, free market, and all the rest for all this while. But it's really rare. I must say, I have hardly ever seen a policy that people can implement on their own on the ground. It's really rare to see this kind of a convergence of principles that we cherish for all this while, the ideals and all the rest, and its actual impact and implementation with the help of the people. This is to me a phenomenal, I am excited just by this sheer fact that I have not come across, I have fought on so many policy debates, but I have rarely come across a situation where there's such a complete convergence in terms of the ideals that we hold, so dear to our hearts, the principle of property rights, and its actual possibility of actually implementing it on the ground with the people themselves. That it's not something that external agencies or the state necessarily has to do it, but we can do it ourselves.
That's a great close. Does anybody have any last questions? All right, I want to thank everyone for coming and everyone for watching, and hopefully we'll get a report back in a year or so and more progress, and that would be great. Thank you, Barun.
Thank you, David. Thanks.